The morning sun cast long shadows across the military base as Colonel Sarah Martinez adjusted the worn civilian clothes that disguised her true identity. For 3 months, she had been living undercover as a kitchen worker in what was supposed to be her own battalion's mess hall. The mission was classified at the highest levels: investigate reports of severe misconduct, discrimination, and abuse of power that had been filtering up through anonymous complaints. Sarah had built her military career on principles of honor, respect, and excellence. When the Pentagon brass approached her about going undercover in her own command, she initially resisted. The idea of spying on her own soldiers felt like a betrayal of trust. But, as more disturbing reports surfaced, incidents of harassment, corruption, and abuse that seemed to be systematically covered up, she realized that sometimes a leader had to make difficult choices to protect those under their command. The transformation had been meticulous. Sarah's usual crisp uniform and polished insignia were replaced with simple work clothes. Her normally styled hair was kept in a simple ponytail, and she wore thick-rimmed glasses that changed the shape of her face. Most importantly, she adopted the persona of Maria Santos, a quiet immigrant woman who spoke broken English and kept to herself. The disguise was so complete that even her closest staff members didn't recognize her during the few times their paths crossed. Working in the kitchen gave Sarah an unprecedented view into the daily lives of her soldiers. She witnessed conversations that would never happen in front of an officer, observed dynamics that remained hidden during formal inspections, and began to understand the true culture that existed beneath the surface of military protocol. What she discovered was far worse than the reports had indicated. The mess hall was run by Sergeant First Class Tommy Rodriguez, a man whose 20-year career had given him significant influence within the battalion. Rodriguez had created what amounted to his own kingdom within the kitchen operations, complete with a hierarchy based not on military rank or competence, but on personal loyalty and willingness to participate in his schemes. Those who fell into his favor enjoyed preferred schedules, better assignments, and protection from disciplinary actions. Those who crossed him found themselves working the worst shifts, facing trumped-up charges, or worse. Rodriguez's inner circle consisted of several soldiers who had bought into his corrupt system. There was Specialist Mike Thompson, a large man who served as Rodriguez's enforcer, using his size and aggressive demeanor to intimidate anyone who questioned their operations. Staff Sergeant Lisa Chen had been drawn into the group through a combination of blackmail and promises of career advancement. Private James Wilson, barely 20 years old, had been recruited through a mixture of peer pressure and the false promise that joining Rodriguez's circle was the only way to survive in the unit. The corruption extended far beyond simple workplace politics. Rodriguez had established an elaborate scheme involving the theft and resale of military supplies, kickbacks from food service contractors, and the systematic harassment of soldiers who refused to participate or look the other way. He had created false documentation to cover up incidents, manipulated duty rosters to reward his allies and punish his enemies, and used his position to gather compromising information about soldiers that he could use as leverage. Sarah watched all of this unfold while maintaining her cover as the quiet kitchen worker who simply wanted to do her job and avoid trouble. She cleaned tables while overhearing conversations about which soldiers were being targeted for harassment. She washed dishes while Rodriguez and his crew planned their next scheme to skim money from the food budget. She served meals while witnessing the systematic humiliation of soldiers who dared to speak up against the toxic culture. The psychological toll of maintaining her cover was enormous. Every day, Sarah had to bite her tongue while watching her soldiers she had sworn to protect and lead, being mistreated by those who were supposed to be their brothers and sisters in arms. She documented everything she witnessed, taking careful mental notes that she would later transcribe in her secure off-base apartment. Each incident was catalogued, each perpetrator identified, each victim's story preserved for the eventual reckoning that would come. The hardest part was witnessing the impact on the younger soldiers. Sarah watched promising young men and women who had joined the military with dreams of service and honor become cynical and demoralized by the toxic environment they found themselves in. She saw soldiers who should have been receiving mentorship and guidance instead being exploited and abused by those in positions of trust. The military's core values of loyalty, duty, respect, selfless service, honor, integrity, and personal courage were being systematically undermined by Rodriguez and his conspirators. As weeks turned into months, Sarah began to understand the full scope of the problem. The corruption wasn't limited to the mess hall operations, it extended throughout various departments of the battalion, all connected by a network of favors, intimidation, and mutual protection. Rodriguez had allies in supply, administration, and even among some of the junior officers who either participated willingly or were too intimidated to speak up. The breaking point came on a cold Tuesday morning in November. Sarah was preparing vegetables for the lunch service when she overheard Rodriguez talking to his inner circle about their latest target, Private Jennifer Walsh, a 22-year-old soldier who had recently filed a formal complaint about harassment she had experienced. Rodriguez was furious that Walsh had gone through official channels rather than trying to handle the situation quietly, and he was planning retaliation that would effectively end her military career. Walsh was exactly the type of soldier the military needed more of: intelligent, dedicated, and unwilling to compromise her principles for the sake of fitting in with a corrupt system. She came from a military family and had joined with genuine desire to serve her country. Her complaint had been detailed and well documented, but Rodriguez had connections in the administrative offices who had warned him about it before it could reach higher levels of command. The plan Rodriguez outlined was sophisticated and cruel. They would plant contraband in Walsh's personal belongings during a surprise inspection, manipulate her duty assignments to set her up for failure, and spread rumors about her character that would isolate her from her fellow soldiers. The goal was to force her out of the military entirely while destroying her reputation in the process. It was a tactic they had used successfully against other soldiers who had threatened their operation. Sarah realized that she couldn't simply continue observing and documenting. Private Walsh was in immediate danger, and her military career, possibly her entire future, hung in the balance. The investigation that Sarah was conducting could take months more to complete, and, by then, it would be too late for Walsh and, potentially, other soldiers who were being targeted. That evening, in the safety of her off-base apartment, Sarah made the decision to accelerate her timeline. She reviewed all the evidence she had gathered, organized her documentation, and began planning how she would reveal her true identity while ensuring maximum impact against the corrupt network she had uncovered. The plan would be dangerous. If Rodriguez and his allies suspected what was happening before she was ready, they could destroy evidence, intimidate witnesses, and potentially even arrange for her to have an accident that would end her investigation permanently. The kitchen had become Sarah's battlefield, and tomorrow she would begin the final phase of an operation that would determine not just her own fate, but the future of every honest soldier under her command. As she prepared for what was to come, Sarah reflected on the oath she had taken when she first became an officer, to support and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. She had never imagined that some of those domestic enemies would be wearing the same uniform she wore, but she was prepared to fulfill her oath regardless of the personal cost. The next morning brought an unexpected opportunity that would change everything. Sarah arrived at the mess hall at her usual time, maintaining the quiet demeanor of Maria Santos while internally preparing for the confrontation she knew was coming. The kitchen was busier than usual as they prepared for a special luncheon honoring visiting dignitaries from the Department of Defense, an event that Rodriguez and his crew saw as another opportunity for profit and corruption. Rodriguez had been planning this event for weeks, using it as a cover for one of his most ambitious schemes yet. He had arranged for premium ingredients to be ordered at inflated prices from contractors who were paying him kickbacks, while planning to serve cheaper alternatives and pocket the difference. The visiting officials would never know that their meal had cost the military twice what it should have, or that Rodriguez was using their visit to steal thousands of dollars in taxpayer money. As Sarah worked through her morning duties, she noticed an unusual level of tension among Rodriguez's inner circle. Thompson kept checking his phone nervously, Chen was snapping at junior soldiers over minor infractions, and Wilson looked like he hadn't slept in days. It became clear that something had gone wrong with their plans, and Rodriguez was in a particularly foul mood as a result. The crisis revealed itself during the mid-morning break when Rodriguez gathered his core group near the storage area where Sarah was organizing supplies. Speaking in hushed but angry tones, Rodriguez explained that one of their contractor contacts had been arrested by military police on unrelated charges. The arrest threatened to expose the entire kickback scheme if the contractor decided to cooperate with investigators in exchange for a reduced sentence. Rodriguez's solution was characteristically ruthless and short-sighted. Rather than cutting their losses and laying low, he decided to accelerate their timeline and extract as much money as possible before the scheme collapsed. This meant increasing the scope of theft and fraud for the day's event, regardless of the increased risk of detection. He assigned specific roles to each member of his crew and made it clear that failure was not an option. Sarah realized that this was exactly the kind of moment she had been waiting for, a chance to catch Rodriguez and his conspirators in the act of a major crime with clear evidence and multiple witnesses. However, she also knew that if she revealed herself too early, they might escape or destroy evidence. She needed to wait for the perfect moment when the crime was undeniable and escape was impossible. The morning progressed with increasing tension as Rodriguez's crew put their plan into motion. Sarah watched as they systematically replaced expensive ingredients with cheaper substitutes, forged receiving documents to hide the theft, and began loading stolen supplies into personal vehicles parked behind the mess hall. Each action was a federal crime, and Sarah was documenting every detail while maintaining her cover as the oblivious kitchen worker. The visiting dignitaries arrived just after noon, a group of senior Pentagon officials and congressional staff members who were conducting a routine inspection of military facilities. Among them was General Patricia Hayes, a woman Sarah had served under early in her career and who had been a mentor and role model. Seeing General Hayes reminded Sarah of why she had chosen to pursue this dangerous undercover mission, to protect the integrity of an institution she loved and the soldiers who depended on strong leadership. Rodriguez had planned the timing carefully, knowing that the presence of high-ranking visitors would provide cover for his activities while also maximizing the psychological impact on any soldiers who might be thinking about reporting misconduct. He wanted everyone to see that he could operate with impunity even under the noses of the most senior military leadership. The luncheon began smoothly, with Rodriguez playing the role of the competent and dedicated non-commissioned officer while his crew executed their theft operation in the background. Sarah continued her duties, serving meals and clearing tables while keeping careful watch on both the criminal activity and the visiting officials who were unknowingly providing cover for it. The turning point came when Private Walsh, the young soldier who had filed the harassment complaint, was assigned to serve the head table where the visiting dignitaries were seated. Rodriguez had specifically arranged this assignment as part of his retaliation plan, intending to humiliate Walsh in front of the senior leadership and damage her reputation within the command. As Walsh approached the table carrying a tray of soup, Rodriguez signaled to Thompson, who deliberately bumped into her from behind. The collision was carefully calculated to look accidental while ensuring maximum spillage and embarrassment. The hot soup splashed across Walsh's uniform and face, causing her to cry out in pain and surprise while the contents of her tray scattered across the floor in front of the shocked dignitaries. Rodriguez immediately began shouting at Walsh, berating her for clumsiness and unprofessional behavior in front of the visiting officials. His performance was designed to humiliate Walsh while positioning himself as the competent leader dealing with an incompetent subordinate. Thompson and the other conspirators joined in, creating a chorus of criticism that left Walsh standing alone and mortified in front of some of the most senior military leaders in the country. The scene was exactly what Rodriguez had planned. Walsh was left looking incompetent and unprofessional, while he appeared to be the steady hand trying to maintain order. The visiting officials looked uncomfortable but didn't intervene, assuming this was an internal military discipline matter that they should not interfere with. General Hayes made a note in her tablet, probably recording the incident as an example of poor training or leadership at the unit level. But Rodriguez had made a critical mistake. In his eagerness to humiliate Walsh, he had chosen to stage the incident directly in front of Sarah, who was cleaning a nearby table. For 3 months, Sarah had been forced to watch Rodriguez abuse his position and harm the soldiers under her command. The sight of this deliberate cruelty against a young soldier who had simply tried to do the right thing was finally too much for her to bear. Sarah stood up slowly, setting down her cleaning supplies with deliberate precision. The mess hall had gone quiet except for Rodriguez's continued berating of Walsh, who was fighting back tears while trying to clean soup from her uniform. Sarah walked directly toward the group, her posture gradually changing from the subservient stance of Maria Santos to the commanding presence of Colonel Sarah Martinez. Rodriguez was so focused on his performance that he didn't notice Sarah's approach until she was standing directly beside him. When he finally looked at her, expecting to see the timid kitchen worker he had been ordering around for months, he instead found himself face to face with a woman whose entire demeanor had transformed. The thick glasses were gone, the submissive posture had vanished, and, in their place stood someone who radiated the unmistakable authority of senior military leadership. "That's enough, Sergeant," Sarah said, her voice carrying the crisp authority of command that had been hidden for 3 months. The words cut through the chaos like a blade, and, suddenly, everyone in the mess hall was looking at the woman who had been invisible to them just moments before. Rodriguez's mouth fell open as recognition slowly dawned. The broken English and timid manner that had defined Maria Santos were completely gone, replaced by the clear, confident speech of an educated officer. Thompson, Chen, and Wilson stared in confusion, unable to process what they were seeing. Even Walsh stopped trying to clean her uniform and looked up in amazement at this sudden transformation. "I said that's enough," Sarah repeated, stepping forward so that she was between Rodriguez and Walsh. "Private Walsh, please step back and get yourself cleaned up. You're not at fault here." The visiting dignitaries had gone completely silent, recognizing that something extraordinary was happening but not yet understanding what it was. General Hayes leaned forward in her chair, her experienced eye-catching details that others missed, the way Sarah carried herself, the natural authority in her voice, the military bearing that no amount of disguise could completely hide. Rodriguez found his voice first, though it came out as a confused stammer. What are you doing? You can't, you're just the kitchen help." Sarah smiled grimly and reached into her pocket, withdrawing the identification that she had kept hidden for 3 months. "Actually, Sergeant Rodriguez, I'm Colonel Sarah Martinez, commanding officer of this battalion. And you're under arrest." The silence that followed was deafening. Rodriguez's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, fear, and, finally, a desperate calculation as he realized the full scope of what had just happened. Thompson's aggressive posture collapsed as the reality hit him. Chen looked like she was going to be sick. Wilson actually took a step backward, as if distance could somehow protect him from what was coming. General Hayes stood up slowly, her eyes fixed on Sarah with a mixture of recognition and professional curiosity. "Colonel Martinez," she said formally, "would you mind explaining what's going on here?" Sarah straightened to attention, the final remnants of her disguise falling away as she assumed her proper bearing as a senior military officer. "General Hayes, for the past 3 months I have been conducting an undercover investigation into systematic corruption and abuse within this command. What you just witnessed was the culmination of a sustained pattern of harassment and retaliation against soldiers who have attempted to report misconduct through proper channels." The mess hall remained frozen as the implications of Sarah's revelation began to sink in. Every conversation Rodriguez and his crew had conducted in her presence, every scheme they had discussed, every crime they had committed, all of it had been witnessed and documented by the commanding officer they thought they were deceiving. Rodriguez made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. "You can't prove anything. You have no evidence. This is entrapment." Sarah's expression didn't change. "On the contrary, Sergeant. I have 3 months of detailed documentation of your activities, including the theft operation you conducted this morning, the kickback scheme with military contractors, and the systematic harassment of soldiers under your command. I've also witnessed multiple federal crimes committed in the presence of senior Defense Department officials." She gestured toward the storage area where the evidence of the morning's theft was still visible. "Military police are currently securing evidence from your personal vehicles and the contractor locations you've been using to fence stolen government property. The investigation you thought you were hiding from has been documenting your every move." As if summoned by her words, the sound of vehicles could be heard outside the mess hall. Through the windows, everyone could see military police vehicles arriving, their occupants moving with the purposeful efficiency of law enforcement conducting planned arrests. The investigation Sarah had been conducting had clearly been coordinated with other agencies, and the net was finally closing around Rodriguez and his conspirators. The visiting dignitaries watched in fascination as what had started as a routine inspection turned into the dramatic conclusion of a major military investigation. General Hayes was taking detailed notes, clearly impressed by the scope and execution of the operation she had unknowingly witnessed. Rodriguez's final act of defiance came as the military police entered the mess hall. "You think you're so smart," he snarled at Sarah. "You think this proves something? The system is bigger than you know. This won't change anything." Sarah looked at him with a mixture of pity and contempt. "Sergeant Rodriguez, in my 20 years of service, I've learned that there are two types of soldiers: those who uphold the values of this institution, and those who corrupt it from within. Today, you and your associates will learn which type ultimately prevails." The military police moved with practiced efficiency, securing the mess hall and beginning the arrest process that would dismantle Rodriguez's corruption network piece by piece. Sarah watched as her months of careful investigation finally bore fruit, but she knew that the arrests were only the beginning of a complex process that would reshape the entire command structure of her battalion. As Rodriguez and his inner circle were led away in handcuffs, the full scope of their crimes began to emerge. The military police had coordinated their operation with multiple agencies, including the Defense Criminal Investigative Service and the FBI, indicating that the corruption had reached levels requiring federal intervention. The evidence Sarah had gathered during her undercover operation had provided the foundation for search warrants, wiretaps, and financial investigations that revealed the true extent of the criminal enterprise. General Hayes approached Sarah once the immediate chaos had settled. The two women stepped away from the crowd of soldiers, visiting officials, and law enforcement personnel to have a private conversation that would prove crucial to how the aftermath of the investigation would be handled. "Colonel Martinez," General Hayes began, "I need to understand the full scope of what you've accomplished here. This level of undercover operation within one's own command is unprecedented in my experience. How did you manage to maintain your cover for 3 months while gathering actionable intelligence?" Sarah provided a detailed briefing on the investigation, explaining how the anonymous complaints had reached the Pentagon, the decision to place her undercover in her own command, and the systematic documentation of crimes and misconduct she had witnessed. She outlined the network of corruption that extended beyond the mess hall operations to include supply chain fraud, personnel manipulation, and the systematic intimidation of soldiers who attempted to report misconduct. The evidence Sarah had gathered was staggering in its scope and detail. She had documented not only the specific crimes committed by Rodriguez and his conspirators, but also the broader culture of corruption that had allowed such behavior to flourish. Her investigation had revealed connections to civilian contractors who were defrauding the government, junior officers who were either complicit or too intimidated to act, and a systematic failure of oversight that had enabled the criminal network to operate with virtual impunity. General Hayes listened intently, asking pointed questions about the evidence and the methods used to gather it. She was particularly interested in how Sarah had maintained operational security while living and working alongside the subjects of her investigation. The psychological challenges of maintaining such deep cover while witnessing crimes against soldiers under her command were unprecedented in military law enforcement. The most difficult aspect, Sarah explained, was watching young soldiers like Private Walsh being systematically targeted and abused while being unable to intervene directly. Every day I had to choose between maintaining my cover and protecting individual soldiers from immediate harm. There were nights when I questioned whether the investigation was worth the ongoing damage to morale and individual careers. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Agent Rebecca Foster from the Defense Criminal Investigative Service, who had been coordinating the federal aspects of the investigation. Agent Foster brought additional context that elevated the significance of Sarah's undercover work far beyond the local corruption they had initially suspected. "Colonel Martinez," Agent Foster said, "your investigation has uncovered connections to a much larger network of military contract fraud that we've been tracking across multiple installations. Rodriguez wasn't just running a local operation, he was part of a sophisticated criminal organization that has been defrauding the Defense Department of millions of dollars annually." The revelation that Rodriguez's activities were part of a larger conspiracy added new dimensions to the case. The contractors who had been paying kickbacks to Rodriguez were simultaneously working similar schemes at other military installations across the country. The investigation had the potential to expose systemic vulnerabilities in military procurement and oversight that had been exploited by organized criminal networks. As the day progressed, Sarah faced the complex challenge of maintaining command authority while transitioning from her undercover role back to her position as battalion commander. The soldiers under her command were struggling to process what they had witnessed. Their quiet kitchen worker revealed as their commanding officer, their feared sergeant and his crew arrested for federal crimes, and the sudden realization that their daily routine had been under investigation for months. Private Walsh, the young soldier whose harassment had triggered the morning's confrontation, approached Sarah during a brief lull in the activities. Still wearing her soup-stained uniform, Walsh struggled to find words to express her gratitude and confusion about what had transpired. "Ma'am," Walsh said hesitantly, "I don't understand what just happened." "Were you really working in the kitchen this whole time? Did you hear about my complaint?" Sarah looked at the young soldier with a mixture of pride and regret. Walsh represented everything that was right about military service: integrity, courage, and a willingness to stand up for what was correct even when facing overwhelming opposition. At the same time, she represented the cost of the corruption that Sarah had been investigating, a promising young soldier whose career and confidence had been damaged by those who should have been protecting and mentoring her. "Private Walsh," Sarah said, "you did exactly the right thing by filing your complaint through proper channels. Your courage in standing up to harassment and intimidation helped expose a criminal network that was harming soldiers throughout this command. You should be proud of your actions, even though they came at personal cost." The conversation with Walsh highlighted one of the most challenging aspects of the investigation's aftermath. While Rodriguez and his conspirators would face justice, the soldiers who had been their victims would need extensive support to recover from the psychological and professional damage they had suffered. Some had been driven out of the military entirely, their careers destroyed by false accusations and systematic harassment. Others had been psychologically damaged by the toxic environment, developing trust issues and cynicism that would take years to overcome. Sarah spent the remainder of the afternoon conducting individual meetings with soldiers who had been affected by the corruption network. Each conversation revealed additional details about the scope of the abuse and the long-term impact on unit morale and effectiveness. The criminal investigation was only one aspect of the recovery process. Rebuilding trust, establishing new leadership structures, and creating a culture of accountability would require sustained effort over many months. The visiting dignitaries extended their inspection to accommodate the extraordinary circumstances they had witnessed. General Hayes, in particular, recognized that Sarah's undercover investigation represented a potential model for addressing corruption in other military commands. The methods used to maintain operational security while gathering evidence could be applicable to other situations where traditional oversight mechanisms had failed. During an impromptu briefing session, General Hayes outlined the broader implications of the investigation for military policy and procedure. "Colonel Martinez," she said, "what you've accomplished here demonstrates both the potential and the risks of deep undercover operations within military commands. We need to understand how to replicate your successes while avoiding the psychological and operational hazards you've experienced." The discussion revealed that Sarah's investigation had identified systemic weaknesses in military oversight that extended far beyond her battalion. The corruption network had exploited gaps in financial monitoring, personnel management, and chain-of-command reporting that existed throughout the military structure. Addressing these vulnerabilities would require changes in policy, training, and accountability measures at multiple levels of command. As evening approached, Sarah found herself alone in her office for the first time in 3 months, finally, able to review the complete scope of what had been accomplished. The evidence she had gathered would support prosecutions not only of Rodriguez and his immediate conspirators, but potentially dozens of other individuals connected to the broader criminal network. The investigation would likely result in policy changes affecting military procurement, oversight procedures, and whistleblower protections throughout the Defense Department. However, the personal cost of the investigation was becoming clear as well. Sarah had spent 3 months living a lie, deceiving soldiers who trusted her, and watching crimes unfold without being able to intervene directly. The psychological strain of maintaining such deep cover while fulfilling her responsibilities as a commanding officer had taken a toll that would require time and support to address. The phone in her office rang, interrupting her reflection. The caller was General Patricia Hayes, who had remained on base to coordinate with federal investigators and begin the process of implementing immediate reforms within the battalion. "Colonel Martinez," General Hayes said, "I want you to know that your sacrifice and dedication have prevented immeasurable damage to this institution and the soldiers under your command." However, I'm also aware of the personal cost of what you've endured. The Defense Department is prepared to provide whatever support you need to transition back to normal command duties. The conversation touched on the complex challenges Sarah would face in rebuilding her relationship with soldiers who felt deceived by her undercover operation, even though they understood its necessity. Trust, once broken, would require careful effort to rebuild, even when the deception had been undertaken for legitimate law enforcement purposes. As Sarah prepared to leave her office that evening, she reflected on the events of the day and their broader significance. The investigation had succeeded beyond her initial expectations, exposing not just local corruption but a network of criminal activity that threatened military integrity at multiple levels. The arrests and evidence gathered would provide the foundation for systemic reforms that could prevent similar corruption in other commands. The soup that had been splashed across Private Walsh's face that morning had become the catalyst for revealing the true nature of command relationships within the battalion. Rodriguez's attempt to humiliate a young soldier had instead exposed his own criminal behavior and brought down the entire network he had built over years of careful manipulation and intimidation. Looking ahead, Sarah knew that the most challenging phase of her mission was just beginning. Cleaning up the corruption and prosecuting the criminals was only the first step in a longer process of rebuilding trust, establishing new leadership standards, and ensuring that the culture of accountability and integrity that should define military service was restored throughout her command. 6 months after the dramatic arrests in the mess hall, Colonel Sarah Martinez stood before the Army's Personnel Review Board in Washington, D.C., providing testimony about the long-term impacts of her undercover investigation. The case had become a landmark study in military law enforcement, influencing policy changes throughout the Defense Department and establishing new protocols for addressing systemic corruption within military commands. The prosecutions resulting from Sarah's investigation had been extraordinarily successful. Rodriguez received a sentence of 15 years in federal prison for conspiracy, theft of government property, and violations of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Thompson, Chen, and Wilson received varying sentences based on their levels of involvement, with Wilson receiving the lightest punishment due to his cooperation with investigators and his status as a junior enlisted soldier who had been manipulated into participation. The civilian contractors connected to the kickback schemes faced separate federal charges in civilian courts, with several receiving sentences exceeding 20 years. The investigation had revealed that the network extended to 12 different military installations across the country, with total losses to the government estimated at over $50 million annually. Sarah's detailed documentation had provided the foundation for the entire prosecution effort, demonstrating the value of sustained undercover operations in complex military criminal cases. However, the personal and professional costs of the investigation had been significant for Sarah as well. The psychological strain of living undercover for 3 months, combined with the complex challenges of rebuilding trust within her command, had required extensive counseling and support. The Army had provided specialized psychological services designed for law enforcement personnel who had conducted deep undercover operations, but the military context created unique challenges that traditional programs weren't designed to address. The relationship between Sarah and her soldiers had evolved in unexpected ways following the revelation of her true identity. Many soldiers initially felt betrayed by the deception, even though they intellectually understood its necessity. The process of rebuilding trust had required complete transparency about the investigation, extensive dialogue about leadership and integrity, and a willingness from Sarah to accept criticism and skepticism from those under her command. Private Walsh, the young soldier whose harassment had triggered the final confrontation, had become an advocate for military justice reform and whistleblower protection. Her experience with Rodriguez's retaliation, followed by witnessing the dramatic conclusion of the investigation, had convinced her to pursue a career in military law enforcement. Walsh was now attending the military police officer candidate school and planned to specialize in investigating misconduct within military commands. The battalion itself had undergone complete restructuring following the investigation. New leadership had been brought in at multiple levels, with particular attention paid to establishing clear reporting mechanisms and accountability measures. The culture change had been dramatic. Anonymous surveys conducted 6 months after the arrests showed significant improvements in morale, trust in leadership, and willingness to report misconduct through proper channels. General Hayes had used the case as a model for developing new training programs for senior military leaders. The investigation had revealed gaps in oversight and accountability that existed throughout the military structure, not just in Sarah's battalion. New protocols were developed for identifying and addressing systemic corruption, with particular emphasis on creating safe channels for soldiers to report misconduct without fear of retaliation. The Defense Department had also implemented new financial oversight measures designed to prevent the type of procurement fraud that Rodriguez had exploited. Automated monitoring systems now tracked unusual patterns in supply orders, contractor relationships, and financial transactions that had previously gone unnoticed. These systems were projected to save the government hundreds of millions of dollars annually while reducing opportunities for corruption. Sarah's testimony before the Personnel Review Board focused on the lessons learned from her experience and recommendations for future operations. She emphasized the importance of psychological support for officers conducting deep undercover operations, the need for clear legal frameworks governing such investigations, and the critical role of institutional support in ensuring the success of complex law enforcement operations within military commands. The decision to go undercover in my own command, Sarah testified, required weighing the immediate harm being done to soldiers against the potential benefits of gathering comprehensive evidence of systemic corruption. Every day of that investigation involved moral and ethical choices that no leader should have to make alone. Future operations of this type must include better support systems and clearer guidance for officers placed in similar situations. The board was particularly interested in the operational security measures Sarah had used to maintain her cover while gathering evidence. The techniques she had developed for documenting criminal activity without detection were being studied for potential application in other military law enforcement contexts. Her ability to maintain psychological stability while living a false identity for an extended period was seen as crucial knowledge for future undercover operations. One of the most significant outcomes of the investigation was the establishment of new protections for military whistleblowers. Private Walsh's experience with harassment and retaliation had highlighted the inadequacy of existing reporting mechanisms. New regulations now provided independent investigation channels, protection from retaliation, and support services for soldiers who report misconduct through proper channels. The case had also influenced civilian law enforcement, with several police departments and federal agencies studying Sarah's methods for potential application in their own undercover operations. The combination of deep cover penetration with systematic evidence gathering over an extended period had proven remarkably effective in dismantling complex criminal networks. During a break in her testimony, Sarah reflected on the personal journey that had brought her to this moment. The shy kitchen worker Maria Santos felt like a character from someone else's life, yet the experience had fundamentally changed her understanding of leadership and the responsibilities that came with command authority. The investigation had shown her aspects of military culture that were normally hidden from senior officers, providing insights that would influence her leadership style for the rest of her career. The afternoon session of the review board hearing focused on policy recommendations and future applications of undercover investigations within military commands. Sarah advocated for the development of specialized units trained in deep cover operations, with specific protocols for maintaining operational security while gathering evidence of systemic misconduct. The military justice system, Sarah explained, is designed to address individual acts of misconduct, not complex criminal enterprises that operate within military commands. When corruption becomes systemic, traditional investigation methods are insufficient. We need specialized capabilities and legal frameworks that can address organized criminal activity within our own ranks. The board's questions revealed the broader implications of Sarah's investigation for military culture and leadership development. The case had demonstrated that senior officers might need to employ unconventional methods to fulfill their responsibilities to protect soldiers under their command. This raised complex questions about the balance between traditional military hierarchy and the need for accountability and transparency. As the hearing concluded, board members expressed appreciation for Sarah's sacrifice and dedication while acknowledging the unprecedented nature of her investigation. The case would be studied in military leadership schools and law enforcement academies for years to come, serving as both a model for successful undercover operations and a cautionary tale about the personal costs of such missions. 6 months after the dramatic confrontation in the mess hall, Sarah received notification that she had been selected for promotion to Brigadier General. The promotion was accompanied by assignment to the Pentagon, where she would help develop new policies and procedures for military law enforcement based on her unique experience with undercover operations. Private Walsh, now Officer Candidate Walsh, attended the promotion ceremony as Sarah's personal guest. The young woman who had been humiliated with splashed soup had become a symbol of courage and integrity within the military justice community. Her willingness to stand up to harassment, despite the personal cost, had ultimately led to the exposure of a criminal network that had been harming soldiers for years. During her promotion speech, Sarah reflected on the lessons learned from her investigation and the responsibility that all military leaders bore to protect the integrity of their institution. Leadership, she said, sometimes requires us to make difficult choices and personal sacrifices to protect those under our command. The uniform we wear represents values that are worth defending, even when that defense requires us to go beyond conventional methods and traditional approaches. The soup that Rodriguez had deliberately splashed across Walsh's face had been intended as a symbol of humiliation and powerlessness. Instead, it had become the catalyst for exposing the truth about corruption within the command and demonstrating that justice could prevail even against seemingly insurmountable odds. The incident had shown that sometimes the most effective response to abuse of power was not immediate confrontation, but patient, systematic investigation that ensured comprehensive accountability. As Sarah assumed her new responsibilities at the Pentagon, she carried with her the knowledge gained from 3 months of living as Maria Santos and the understanding that true leadership sometimes required leaders to step outside their traditional roles to protect those they were sworn to serve. The investigation had been a success, but, more importantly, it had reinforced the principle that in the military, as in society, justice and integrity must ultimately prevail over corruption and abuse of power. The transformation from the quiet kitchen worker who cleaned tables and washed dishes to the general officer addressing military policy at the highest levels of government represented more than just a successful undercover operation. It demonstrated the power of dedication, courage, and systematic investigation to overcome even the most entrenched corruption and abuse of power within institutions that depended on trust and integrity for their effectiveness. Years later, when military historians studied the case, they would focus not just on the investigative techniques or the prosecutorial success, but on the moment when a commanding officer chose to reveal herself rather than allow continued abuse of a young soldier who had done nothing wrong except try to serve with integrity. In that moment, the true meaning of military leadership had been displayed not through traditional command authority, but through the willingness to sacrifice personal safety and career security to protect those who had no one else to defend them. The story of the soup splashed across Private Walsh's face had become a legend within military circles, but its true significance lay in what it revealed about the responsibility that came with leadership and the courage required to fulfill that responsibility when conventional methods were insufficient to protect those who depended on strong, ethical leadership for their safety and well-being.